Good evening, everybody. Welcome. So glad you're here. This is Ronnie's final two lectures toward his instructor certification. Ronnie, you have a guest there. Tell us who that is.
Oh, this is Cleopatra. Kitty cat.
Cleopatra. It's
long time.
adorable. Ronnie, tell us a little bit about what this means to you to be earning your instructor certification coming up really soon. My understanding is you have Thursday, you have Instructor Institute, and then you take your exam on the 9th, and then you will pretty much be done.
Yeah.
How does it feel? This has been a long process, a lot of work, right?
Yeah, it's been 7.5 years of work. I never really anticipated that this would be something that I'd be doing. Even when I started scuba diving, I didn't really think that I'd be like that heavy into the leadership side. But, not only has it helped me physically and just, like with the nerve pain, the back pain, just everything that's come with the nerve damage that I endured, and the family that came along with it. It's been really great. I couldn't have imagined it. I think you remember in the hospital where I was pretty incredulous about the whole thing, but you said it could be done. So, I appreciate your help with all of it.
Absolutely. Now, there may be people watching live on Facebook right now who don't have a clue about your story. So why don't you briefly share your story with everybody?
So I was a student at FSU. I started in 2011. In 2014, November, I was shot and paralyzed at Stroger Library. I have a complete injury to my T11. It affects up to my T10. I also have some nerve damage to my radial nerve as well on my right arm. That's the second bullet. And I went to rehab in Shepherd, but I initially met you at the neuro ICU at TMH before going there. And
hey, Ija, thank you. Thank you, Ija. Much appreciated. He's fast. Yeah. And so I met you because I had a therapy dog who has since passed away, but golden retriever named Bodhi. And I was on the animal therapy team, and we met your family initially first, and then you. And the first thing that I said to you was, hey, I've heard you like the outdoors. Are you scuba certified by any chance? You said no, but I'd love to learn. And then I said, when you get better, look me up and I'll give you a full scholarship. And I remember you saying, but I'm paralyzed. Can I really scuba dive? And I'm like, you're going to be just as good, if not better, than any completely able-bodied person. And even at the time, I had no idea how good you would be. It wasn't until we got in the pool at FSU, we got in the pool there, and instantly you just took to it. You were so good. And Ronnie, your leadership skills are exceptional. I am so happy that you are not just a member of this team, but really you're my right hand when it comes to this entire thing. And I'm very thankful for your skills, for your patience, for your capabilities, for your compassion for other people. It makes you, I think, an excellent instructor. And so I look forward to celebrating when you officially earn your instructor certification.
Absolutely.
So at this point, I'm just going to say, take it away, Ronnie, and tell us a little bit about your topic and why it's important before you begin.
Okay. So my topic is deep sea coral. The reason I chose it was because I remember when I first started scuba diving, one of the slides on the SEI open water presentations said that that corals only exist up to like 30 feet or something like that. Like that's the deepest thing going. I was like, well, that's not technically true. There's deep sea corals and stuff like that. So I think it's something that we don't really hear a lot about. A lot of people don't know about. I actually learned a lot researching it and reading about it. It's actually, I think, a bigger magnitude than even I understood. So I think a lot of people could learn a lot from this topic.
Absolutely. And one thing I love about teaching, Ronnie, is that you do learn a lot. You learn more from teaching than anything else. So teach us what we need to know about deep sea coral, and you have 15 minutes starting now.
Okay, so thank you all for being here. So initially, I know you guys can't read the text on this, but I just kind of wanted to show you the general morphology of corals. So they've got the tentacles covered with nematocysts, those stinging cells that we talk about in open water. The tentacles will capture prey and then feed it to the mouth. There's actually a lot of really cool videos that you can watch of the polyps actually grabbing things and bringing them to the mouth. And then what you can see right here is that they're actually connected. It's kind of like fungus or plants, as they actually connect to other nearby members and form colonies. So just like their shallow water cousins, they are made of small animals that are built up skeleton, which grow in many shapes and a paint box of colors. Scientists have discovered polyps as small as grains of rice, colonies as tall as 35 feet, and reefs that stretch for 25 miles. So these are the main types of corals that you'll see in the wild. So you have hexacorals, which are your hard corals. So you have sea anemones, which are soft, black corals, which are hard coral morphs, stony corals, that's most of what we'll be looking at today, and zoanthids are all hexacorals. Then you also have octocorals, another subclass of corals. So you have the soft corals and gorgonians, which are whips and fans, blue corals, penatulas, and sea feathers, pens, and pansies. These are all soft corals. And then finally, you have an additional tube-dwelling anemones as well. I don't know a terrible lot about them, though. So here are some major stony corals, the sclerothins that we were talking about. So the first one is A, Lophelia pertussa. B is the ivory tree coral, Ocalina verrucosa. That'll be important for a lot of Floridians. C, the large Gorgonian coral with squat lobster and brittle star. D, a bamboo coral. E, a black coral. And then F, a stelasterid coral. So there are many species, there are actually more species of deep water corals than shallow water species, though only a few deep water species develop traditional reefs. Instead, they form aggregations called patches, banks, bioherms, massifs, thickets, or groves. These aggregations are often referred to as reefs, but differ structurally and functionally. Unlike shallow water reefs, deep sea corals are found throughout the world's oceans from tropical to polar regions. Unlike their shallow counterparts, deep sea corals are created by stony corals that form large geological structures, albeit 20 times slow, or 10 to 20 times slower than their shallow water counterparts. So here we have some Lophelia plants. So unlike tropical reefs, they can live anywhere from 150 feet to more than 20,000 feet below sea level, where sunlight is dim to non-existent. Instead of forming rock-like reefs, they often form cold water corals, form groves of trees, feathers, columns, or fan shapes. And many fish, shrimp, crabs, and other creatures use corals and sponges as their habitat. They estimate 85% of commercial fishes are associated with deep sea coral habitats, including grouper, snapper, bass, and rockfish. So this is an important concept to consider when talking about corals, shallow waters and deep ones as well, actually. So this is the saturation of calcium carbonate. So there's two different forms of calcium carbonate, but essentially the idea is as pressure increases, calcium carbonate becomes more and more dissolvable to a point where at certain depths it is not possible to sequester enough calcium to form a shell or a skeleton, which is part of the reason that these cold water corals are so interesting. So this, like I was saying, there's two types of calcium carbonate. So you have calcite and aragonite start dissolving at different depths. Despite this principle, scientists have discovered deep sea corals and sponges on continental shelves, slopes, canyons, and seamounts. And as you can see, the aragonite actually dissolves a little bit faster than the calcite. So you can find calcite structures deeper than aragonite structures. So deep sea corals and sponges feed on microscopic organisms like I talked about earlier. They can flow through ocean currents. However, unlike warm water corals, they do not require sunlight as a source of nutrition. So they either feed off detritus or nearby plankton through the currents. So deep sea corals grow very slowly, like I said before, 10 to 20 times slower than the shallow water counterparts, which are also very slow growing, with some specimens found to be thousands of years old. As coastal resources become depleted, humans have begun to move deeper in search of new resources of food and energy. The greatest impact to deep sea corals comes from the commercial bottom trawls, which use heavy gear to harvest deep sea fishes and damage structures that grow on the sea floor, such as deep sea corals. Longline fishing is also harmful, and both methods can release clouds of sediment that smother reefs. So about 60% of reefs occur next to or inside seabed pockmarks. These craters are formed by the expulsion of hydrocarbon liquids and gases. So several scientists hypothesize that there may be a link between the existence of deep water corals and nutrient seepage through the sea floor. This hypothesis is called the hydraulic theory. So mining machines are large and permanently remove large areas of these deep sea coral habitats. A study conducted in 2015 found that injury observed in populations in the Mississippi Canyon and the Gulf of Mexico increased from 4 to 9% to 38 to 50% after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And for those of you that were there for my previous talk, you'll remember how I also mentioned the dispersants will actually make the oil more deadly, up to 52% more deadly to the corals as well, at least the shallow water ones. And I assume that this holds up for deep water ones if it can reach it as well. So most of the deep sea coral research in the Gulf of Mexico has been focused on the northern region, which is where energy interests are focused, but the eastern Gulf is relatively unexplored. Earlier surveys in this area discovered abundant and thriving Lophelia reefs, as well as aggregations of large black corals. However, multi-beam surveys have revealed vast areas where there are many other promising features that have never been explored. Lophelia communities support diverse marine life such as sponges, polychaete worms, mollusks, crustaceans, brittle stars, starfish, sea urchins, bryozoans, sea spiders, and fish hosting up to 1,300 species on one reef. So most of the deep sea, and this is just a picture from the Gulf actually. And the deep sea corals, sponges, and other habitat forming animals provide protection from currents and predators, nurseries for young fish, and feeding, breeding, and spawning areas for numerous fish and shellfish species. Rockfish, Atka mackerel, Wally pollock, Pacific cod, Pacific halibut, sableye, flatfish, crabs, and other economically important species to the North Pacific inhabit these areas. 83% of the rockfish found in one study were associated with red tree corals, where flatfish, pollock, and Pacific cod appear to be more commonly caught around soft corals. Dense schools of female redfish, heavy with young, have been observed on Lophelia reefs off Norway, suggesting the reefs are breeding grounds and nursery areas for some species. Octolina reefs are also important spawning grounds for several grouper species, as well as other fisheries. So this is interesting for Floridians. We have colonies of Analobasamia contribute to the framework of banks found 2,000 to 2,600 feet in the Straits of Florida around the Keys. Additionally, the Octolina banks exist in 160 feet to 330 feet of water, stretching 106 miles from Fort Pierce to Daytona Beach. They are significant spawning grounds for commercially important food species, including gag, scamp, red grouper, speckle hind, sea bass, red porgy, rock shrimp, and calico scallops. So one important way we protect habitats such as deep sea corals is through marine national monuments and national marine sanctuary programs. For instance, and excuse me for this pronunciation, Papahananoa Mokuakea Marine National Monument is a string of atolls and islands, including Midway Islands lying north and west of familiar Hawaiian Islands. On every mission, intense exploration of these productive regions have revealed spectacular deep sea corals and other animals. As a matter of fact, NOAA discovered, and this is the actual sponge, the world's largest sponge to ever be discovered. It is the size of a minivan, so it's pretty cool looking. So using coral dating methods, scientists have estimated that some living deep water corals date back at least 10,000 years. As deep sea corals grow, they form layers and bands like tree rings. The chemical composition of the bands reflects the changing ocean conditions under which corals formed. By measuring and examining the thickness of each band, marine scientists can estimate how much coral grew during a given time. This information sheds light on what the coral conditions existed during that period. By conducting more complex analyses of the deep sea corals, scientists can gather valuable information about changes in water temperature, nutrition, and ocean circulation over time. Corals are also harvested directly for their black, red, and gold skeletons, which are used for jewelry and ornamentations. So scientists recently discovered that two sponges that grow in deep sea coral ecosystems have compounds with anti-inflammatory and antiviral properties. A compound from another deep sea sponge, Discodermia dissoluta, displays potent anti-tumor activity against human lung and breast cancer cells. Among the surprising coral gardens discoveries are organisms that produce compounds useful in fighting antibiotic-resistant infections as well. Deep sea coral clusters provide shelters for an unknown number of species that are new to science and can provide us an unknown benefit to science, medicine, and even building and growth. So these are some of the main organizations that I found that deal with deep sea corals. There are even some volunteering opportunities with them, and you can also donate to them, obviously. And then there was this great little video that I found talking about deep sea corals. I don't know if the sound will come through, but hopefully it's good enough without sound. And I just kind of wanted to reiterate how important all of these different species are towards biodiversity, towards fishing nurseries, breeding grounds, spawning grounds, incredibly important. And I think the more we learn about them, the more we'll see how important they are to food webs and food ecology of the future. And that's all I had for deep sea corals.
Excellent. I like that video a lot. Tell us, what did you enjoy learning about the most, Ronny, or what surprised you the most with this topic?
I think the connection to hydrocarbons and deep sea seepage, like from asphalt seeps and methane seeps and all kinds of stuff. It's just very interesting how we go to drill those areas, releasing too much in excess in the areas, harming the ecosystem. But if done in a controlled, natural way, it actually flourishes and provides a lot of biodiversity and just ecosystems we would have never thought about.
Excellent. I'd like to open it up to other questions at this time.
Great job, Ronnie.
Thank
I
you.
have one question. When we do the open water presentations and talk about how important corals and coral reef are, we talk a lot about how important the symbiosis between the polyps and zooxanthellae is. And these deep sea corals are beyond that 200 meters layer, right? Like 600 feet deep is the photic zone. So it's where the light can penetrate. And these deep sea coral are under, so are in the photic zone. No lights there. So how do you think is that difference in the metabolism when we say that in a regular coral, at least 80% of the metabolic process of the polyp comes from the zooxanthellae photosynthesis, and only 20% about for when they eat. How do they change that into the deep sea corals? How is that difference?
So they can't use zooxanthellae at all. As you said, there's no light there, it's aphotic. So what they do is they have to filter feed, just like sponges or some other creatures. So that's what those polyps are doing. What those nematocysts are doing. They're grabbing plankton, they're grabbing detritus, they're grabbing anything with nutrients, even refuse, feces, stuff like that. They'll take in and metabolize, and then like I said, they also grow 10 to 20 times slower. Coral already grows very slowly, and these deep sea corals grow significantly slower. So when things like trawling or drilling harms large patches of it, it's a big deal because it takes, like I said, tens of thousands of years for some of those structures to form.
Anyone else have questions? Good question, Victor. Joelle, welcome. Joelle,
Hi,
hi, how are you? I know this is not your kind of area of study. So what did you learn, or what questions do you have from watching the lecture that Ronny just gave?
One thing that I found interesting was, I believe he said there was more species of was it coral than they are species in the ocean?
So there's more species of deep water coral than shallow water coral.
Shallow water. Oh, okay.
So that's what I was talking about earlier. So when we talk about it in open water, we only talk about shallow water coral, because to be able to see these deep water corals, you need at least advanced diving, if not technical to like submarines. You would need super complex diving. So that's why they use NOAA uses ROVs and robots to explore these areas.
That's very fascinating.
Thanks, Joelle.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
Bill, Jacob, any questions for Ronny before he moves on to his next topic?
I have a comment. I'll go, Bill, go.
I was just gonna say, I didn't have any questions, but good job on that, Ronny.
Thank you.
Victor, go ahead with your comment too.
Yeah, I read, I think a couple of years ago, an article that the scientists have discovered a really interesting deep sea coral reef right in the mouth of the Amazon River. And they would never expect that, but of course, because of the plume of the water goes so far, you would expect that it would be fresh water. But it turns out that the alkaline, the saltwater intrusion actually goes inside of the mouth of the Amazon River and creates this habitat, which is very specific for deep sea corals. So I found that it was very, very interesting, and you would never expect something like that, right?
Very new science, very new species, still learning a lot about them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jacob, you are the newest member of the leadership team. Any questions? You always have good questions.
I didn't really have any questions. The only one I was gonna ask was like already asked by Victor. No, I was gonna make a comment about like sea snow.
Yeah, marine
which
snow.
Yeah, but yeah, that's all I thought about for the most part.
No worries. Well, thank you for being here, Ronnie. Good job. Let's move on to your next lecture. Yes, give him a round of applause. Woohoo!
Great job.
All right, he has one final lecture for his instructor certification. Let me share with you that he was only given this topic 24 hours in advance. And so this is, obviously he had less prep time for it, but this should be an informative lecture. So Ronnie, your time starts right now. Tell us why this is important and teach us.
Okay. So regulator function, obviously regulators are super important for us because it's how we have the life-saving connection underwater. So that is, yeah. So first of all, I wanted to talk about how we have multiple parts to our regulators. So we have the first stage, which is this part right here, that part up top. The second stages are what we breathe through. That's the mouthpieces. So the gases may be supplied from the scuba cylinder or from hoses from a compressor or high pressure storage cylinder at the surface. The first stage portion of a scuba regulator can rely either on a piston or a diaphragm to accomplish lowering the tank's pressure to an intermediate pressure. Unbalanced first stage regulators are unable to keep the intermediate pressure consistent due to changes in depth and lower tank pressures, increasing breathing resistance. A balanced first stage routes air to both sides of the poppet valve, giving unvaried intermediate pressure, so breathing resistance is the same despite external conditions such as depth or cylinder fullness. There's also another class of first stage regulators called overbalanced that slowly increases the intermediate pressure as you descend deeper. So we mostly use yoke. And ours, that's what I have on mine, is all called type A. However, a lot of scientific divers and European divers use DIN. So the DIN system is less common worldwide, but has the advantage of withstanding greater pressure, allowing the use of high pressure cylinders, and are less susceptible to blowing an O-ring seal if impacted. Though something to note with both of these is if you're going to be using a high oxygen mixture, you must have them cleaned with components, lubricants, and serviced for oxygen use. So this is the piston first stage that I was talking about. So the force of the bias spring and the ambient water pressure, which comes in right here, that's what this arrow is. So the ambient water pressure is coming in through here. Push inward on either the piston or diaphragm, raising the valve and creating an opening between the intermediate and high pressure chamber. The air flows from the high pressure chamber into the intermediate pressure chamber and down to the regulator second stage via the connecting hose. When the diver stops inhaling, pressure inside the intermediate chamber increases until it's greater than that of the bias spring and hydrostatic pressure, and the valve closes. When the regulator pressurizes by opening the tank valve, the piston moves and allows air to pass through the high pressure seat. When the pressure inside of the regulator reaches intermediate pressure, the poppet valve closes against the seat and the airflow stops. So this is the poppet. Here's the bias springs. You also have another set of springs down here, and it's called the valve springs. So this is the high pressure seat, and that's how it plugs in. So the piston lifts when it is pressurized and allows for air to flow through. So the other style is diaphragm. So a diaphragm first stage uses a thick piece of rubber that is pressed up against a metal pin seated on a spring, and then the hard plastic high pressure seat. There is another spring pushing the diaphragm from the opposite direction, holding it closed. When the regulator is pressurized by opening the tank of the cylinder valve, the spring against the plastic high pressure seat opens and gas flows into the second chamber until immediate pressure is reached. The diaphragm is protected by a cover with holes and slits which outside water can enter freely. This cover reduces sensitivity of the diaphragm to water turbulence, dynamic water pressure due to movement, which might otherwise trigger gas flow when it is not needed. And then this is an animation of a diaphragm. a first stage, let me clarify, a first stage diaphragm. So this is actually a balanced diaphragm. And the way you can tell is that these two sides are connected, which mean that they're connected to the second stage. So as the second stage becomes equal to the ambient pressure of the water, whatever depth you are at, it will allow this diaphragm to reset and stop the flow of compressed air from the cylinder. So like I said, from there, it goes down the connecting hose to your second stage. So the second stage reduces the air from your intermediate pressure to ambient pressure so that you can safely breathe. The second stage uses a flexible silicone diaphragm, just like the diaphragm first stage we were looking at, to seal water and debris out, but air inside of the second stage. There is a lever that rests against the diaphragm that operates the valve in the inlet fitting. When you inhale, it lowers the air pressure inside the second stage. This allows water outside to push the diaphragm in slightly, which pushes on the lever behind the diaphragm until it equals the ambient pressure. It opens the valve and allows air to rush in until it equals the ambient pressure. The pressure difference between the inside of the mouthpiece and the ambient pressure outside of the diaphragm required to open the valve is known as cracking pressure. So here's another couple of animations. This one's a little more cartoony, and this one's a little more detailed. So when the diver starts to inhale, the removal of gas from the casing lowers the pressure inside the chamber, and the external water pressure moves the diaphragm inward, operating a lever which lifts the valve off its seat, releasing gas into the chamber. The interstage gas, which is about 120 to 150 psi over ambient pressure, expands through the valve orifice as its pressure is reduced to ambient and supplies the diver with more gas to breathe. When the diver stops inhaling, the chamber fills until the external pressure is balanced. The diaphragm returns to its resting position, and the lever releases the valve to be closed by the spring, and the gas flow stops. The design of the second stage keeps ambient pressure in the housing at the same pressure as the surrounding water, ensuring that the reg enables consistent breathing efforts regardless of the conditions or depth. And you can really see on this one some of the intricacies of the shaping of the Venturi lever, of the inlet valves, of the poppets that they use. It's a lot of very fine machining, a lot of fine engineering. So the performance of a regulator is measured by the cracking pressure and atomechanical work of breathing, and the capacity to deliver breathing gas at the peak inspiratory flow rate at highest ambient pressure without excessive pressure drop and without excessive dead space. And that's so you don't have a buildup of carbon dioxide or anything like that that would be toxic to your body. So cracking pressure also affects how easily regulators free flow. So if you have a regulator that's free flowing a little too easy, you might be able to dial that down depending on your regulator setup. So for example, this one has a breathing resistance knob right over here that you can change, and that will change the cracking pressure. So for some cold water diving applications, the capacity to deliver high flow rates at ambient pressure without jamming due to regulator freezing is important. If it starts to free flow, what will happen is that causes a pressure drop within your tubes, and the free flowing will allow more gas to come through it, which will drop the temperature even more, which causes even more freezing. So it's a self-positive feedback loop. So it can be very difficult to deal with if you are an ice diver, and it's one of the main problems that I've seen people talk about with ice diving. So here we have another diagram of different uses, or the regulator in different parts of use. So when the diver exhales, one of the valves made from a flexible airtight material flexes outward under the pressure of exhalation, letting gas escape from the chamber. They close, making a seal when the exhalation stops and the pressure inside the chamber reduces to ambient pressure. Exhaled gas leaves the demand valve housing through one or two exhaust ports. Exhaust valves are necessary to prevent the diver inhaling water and to allow negative pressure difference to be induced over the diaphragm to operate the demand valve. A non-return valve is also often fitted on the breathing hose where they connect to the mouthpiece. This is to prevent any water from going into the mouthpiece and going into the hose, and ensures that it cannot flow back. This not only increases the flow resistance of the air, but also makes it easier to clear the regulator when you try to purge it. So this is the bottom part, is kind of what we're talking about right now, that exhaust valve. So it allows, as well as the Venturi lever from before. So as you exhale, it closes the Venturi lever and then pushes the excess pressure out the exhaust valve, until you hit the ambient pressure of the surrounding water. And that's how you have balanced regulators. So finally, we have the Octopus was invented by Dave Woodward at Unexo around 1965 to support the free dive attempts of Jacques Mayol. Woodward believed that having the safety divers carry 2 second stages would be safer and more practical approach than buddy breathing in a case of emergency. The hose on an Octopus is also usually longer than the hose on a primary demand valve that the diver uses, and the demand valve may be colored yellow in the aid of locating an emergency. The second regulator should be clipped to the diver's harness in a position where it can be easily seen, reached by both divers and the potential share of air. Those of you that have taken the class or that are taking the class will find out that we use necklaces. So we have necklaces that attach it right to our neck, and it makes it really easy, because I will tell you the one time that I have used it in a emergency, I pushed the regulator that I had in my mouth out, and then because it was right here, I could just instantly pull it straight to my mouth and start breathing. It was really nice. I did get a little bit of water in my mouth, but it's a lot better than a lot of water in my mouth. And the nice thing about these styles, which is the ones that we use for our class, not only is it low profile, so it's not slinging around, hitting you in the face or anything like that. It's actually breathes both ways. So I actually use that to my advantage occasionally, but that's not something that we typically have to worry about. So some common regulator problems that we have. So inlet filter blockage. This is one of the big reasons that we also tell students to put the dust cap back. It's also expensive to do services on these regulators. As you saw, the fine details on the machining and on the pieces within these mechanisms are very detailed and very fine. So if you get, especially for something like the piston setup, if you get a lot of debris in there, it can cause problems, blockage, and stoppage. Free flows, which I think everyone in scuba knows what we're talking about, super common. But like I was kind of saying before, your cracking adjustments will change how often something free flows, as well as ice diving and things of that nature. And we, of course, go through all the different ways of dealing with free flow in our class. We have sticking valves. That's kind of another issue of things getting into the regulators, especially like the second stage and things of that nature. A lot of moving parts in there. So if you get any debris or improper lubricants, it can cause things to seize up. Freezing, like I mentioned before, they have these little fins that you can actually add to your hoses that allow the heat of the water to more easily radiate into the hoses. It's very interesting. The wings on the valves aren't very big, but apparently it's enough to help with freezing. Intermediate pressure creep. This is something I actually didn't really know a lot about. So apparently this is when you have a leak from your first stage going into your second stage. And it pressurizes your hose often and will lead to blowouts of your hoses. So it can be a little scary if you were next to it, especially if you were underwater or something like that. But I've never seen that. And I think as hose technology gets better and better, I think it's something that happens less often. Gas leaks. This is something that's very common as well with scuba diving. My thing leaked for months. It was just like a little bit loose on one of the connectors. Most leaks aren't a big deal. Obviously, if it's a major leak, you have to get it serviced and fixed. But in general, that's not usually too big of an issue for us. Usually it's small enough that we don't have to worry about it. Wet breathing, obviously this is going to be very concerning, especially for our new students and stuff like that. If you're getting water and little bits of aspiration into your lungs when you're trying to breathe underwater, that can be very scary. So that can be a couple different issues. That could be a crack, would always be the worst case scenario, but it could be a problem with your exhaust port, your non-return valve, your purge button might have gotten, like your diaphragm might have gotten, stabbed, something like that. I don't think it's something very common, but, obviously if you were having wet breathing, you'd want to get that checked out. Excessive work of breathing. This is something that you'll see fairly commonly, actually, especially with new setups and regulators. Sometimes you also have to change that cracking volume, like I was talking about, to get it to the right cracking pressure. and it should be easy at any depth. And obviously having a balance, which is pretty much industry standard at this point, a balanced regulator and first and second stage is the industry standard at this point. And then juddering and shuttering. This is something we'll hear every now and then. Sometimes it has to do with the air not being turned all the way on, but other times it has to do with debris and things of that nature. So there's a couple things that can cause juddering and shutting, but honestly, we don't deal with that too much. Though one of the other things that I did want to mention is over or under tightening. Over tightening is obviously more common for us to see, especially with new students. They kind of just like crank it down and assume that it needs to be super tight for everything to be all locked up. But actually over tightening is actually bad, can degrade the O-rings, can cause it to fail. And then under tightening obviously can have its own issues as well as O-ring extrusion and things of that nature. And two of the things that I didn't talk about in regards to regulators that we obviously don't deal with since we are open water divers and recreational divers are rebreathers and reclaim regulators. But those obviously have very many specialties of their own that I won't go into, but we'll leave to your consideration. And that is exactly my 15 minutes. So thank you, everyone.
Excellent job, Ronnie. That was right on the money, 15 minutes. Perfect. Yeah. Show us your regulator set and tell us about anything you didn't get a chance to talk about, like gauges and things.
So I didn't talk about, the gauges. So I have an electronic one. I don't know why I'm holding it to my non-existent GoPro. Sorry, have it. So this is my gauge. This is Oceanic 3 Plus, I believe.
Pro plus 3.
Pro plus 3. There we go. Yep.
Yeah. And
it's got the compass on it, which I really like this style of compass. Some of the other compasses don't flow quite as nice. Screen super easy to read, backlit, logs it. This is also a high pressure hose where the rest of the hoses are low pressure hoses, which I thought was a little interesting tidbit. I have the same Octopus that we use as our students, obviously. And honestly, it was kind of interesting because the fins that I was talking about look very similar to. Okay, there was water in there apparently. But yeah, the fins look very similar to these little metal bits right here, which I'm sure you can't see terribly well because of my resolution. But that's what the de-icing fins that I was talking about looked like. We'll clean up that water.
Ronnie, what happens when, what's the function issue when somebody breathes a regulator that's only breathable one way with a chin guard? When they breathe it upside down, what's happening to cause them to inhale water?
So that's the one time I panicked to grab my Octo.
Exactly.
We were doing an HSA drill, and it was extra terrifying because I was simulating a quadriplegic diver. So my hands were tied. My feet obviously don't work because I'm paralyzed. So and then he hands me his reg, and I'm looking at it and I see it coming in upside down. And I know that if you take a regular reg, so mine will do the same thing. This regular second stage, so this is the orientation it's supposed to be. This is how I got it underwater. So when I inhaled on this, I got a mouthful of water. And that's when I did the thing that I was talking about where I pushed it away and then I grabbed the Octo and pulled it to my face as fast as I could.
What causes the breathing to only happen one way? Is it the lever?
I believe it is the exhaust ports.
Okay.
That the exhaust ports only function in when in an upside down orientation, they're allowed to free flow essentially. So it allows water in.
Okay. Other questions? I'd love to hear other questions.
So what do you think the most important part of the regulator set is?
So I would say that the principle is the most important part. So that idea of how, let me get my cat off my computer real quick. That idea of how you use the ambient pressure of the water surrounding you to dictate when the second stage turns off, that dictates when the first stage turns off. because once the ambient pressure is reached in the second stage, that valve shuts. Once the intermediate pressure in the hose is reached, that valve shuts off. And then once the high pressure is reached in the cylinder, that turns off, you know? So it's like a self correcting system. It's very, very intelligent.
Thank you, Bill, for that question. Other questions?
I have one question. So you talk about the first stage being different types. We have diaphragms and we have pistons. Considering the pros and cons of each one, which will you recommend for scuba divers, especially for beginners who are, you know, willing to go out there and buy their regulator set? Which will be your recommendation for them?
So this was actually one of the things that I actually kind of wanted to ask Gabrielle about, because I was actually kind of curious about it too, especially when it comes to disabilities and things of that nature. So what I was reading was the diaphragm is protected from the environment. So I could go back to and show you, but the rubber actually covers the whole thing and doesn't allow anything into the mechanism. Whereas the piston, like I try to point out, actually has a hole to the outside. And that's to allow that pressure gradient to function. And that's part of the reason pistons are a little more susceptible to debris and things in the water. But really, as students, especially open water students, we're not going into gnarly water and stuff like that. So a piston is going to work just fine. And what's interesting is pistons apparently provide a little bit more airflow than diaphragm for stages. The diameter of the orifice that it takes is a little bit larger, so you get a little bit more flow from it. So I was wondering if that would be more helpful for people with quadriplegia who don't have the same strength to pull with their lungs that most people do. And I wondered if a piston would be more suited for people with quadriplegia or not. You're muted.
Sorry. We haven't had any issues with our regulator sets with a number of quadriplegic divers. I think the difference is negligible for the diving that we're doing. We're not doing super deep diving, where it might be a little more apparent. So with quadriplegic divers, we're typically, 60 feet is going to be the max. And typically we're a little more like 30 to 40 with quadriplegic divers. Yeah. And we haven't had any issues whatsoever, even with people who are, low function quads. They've been able to breathe fine. But that's a good question. That's a really good question and a good answer, Ronnie. Thank you.
No one else has any other questions. I do have a question for you, assuming no one else has questions.
Okay. Any other questions from the viewers? Jacob, you got a question?
Not really a question, but my regulator, I don't know if it's like a different setup, diaphragm, whatever, but it allows me to actually breathe upside down.
My Octo is like that. So yeah, I definitely use that to my advantage.
Are like that, yeah.
That's all I had. I didn't really have any questions.
Yeah, most of them though, they have a chin guard there for a reason. You want to make sure it's correct, otherwise you end up like Ronnie's dive buddy in that HSA class, while practicing skills, and Ronnie's arms and legs were tied and he was handed the regulators upside down and he breathed in water, but he did a really good job. I could see his eyes like, oh crap. And I looked at him like, you got this. And he did, and he responded and solved the problem underwater. And that's one reason I really like that we have the Octo right here, so that if anything happens, you could just reach down without hands if needed. If something happened with entanglement or anything else, you could just reach down and go ahead and get your alternate air source of the Octopus. So
I have a final question, Ronnie. What are your thoughts about the integrated regulator in your BCD, in your power inflator hose on BCD?
So that is also, that class is another reason why I don't like that either. It makes rescues so much harder. It makes the skills so much more difficult. It makes buddy breathing harder. It just makes every safety measure that we teach students harder and more stressful, which is obviously not a good thing to have with new students. I like unless, sorry, Kitty. Like, we only go diving with buddies. So like, I just don't see a reason to not have our style of Octo, because it not only is it reversible, it has that nice long hose. The ones on the inflator are super short, and then you've got the inflator in your mouth if you need to do anything with that. It's just, it works great for, people who like, going alone, but that's just not, it's not safe, and it's not how we dive.
So definitely not a recommendation for new divers. That's the conclusion.
Definitely don't recommend it. It's
I
not impossible.
completely
but I
agree
don't
with
recommend
Ronnie on that. And yeah, and also, if you are needing to actually perform a rescue, you would reach for the one that is integrated and then hand your primary. But then you have the added issue of trying to deal with controlling buoyancy, which you're normally doing, with that same thing that you're breathing out of. It does make it a lot more challenging. So good answer, Ronnie. Good question. Anyone else?
it.
All right,
My
Ronnie.
question-
Did
So
someone
what would-
say something?
Yeah, I have a question
Yeah,
for
go
you,
ahead.
actually.
Uh-oh.
Do you think, and I was just like wondering while looking at all this stuff, do you think, because I know one of the big things, like especially since we just got back from Family Cafe, which went very well, but one of the things that we often struggle with as well at Rotary Youth Camp is tactile
Mhm.
issues. So I was, I know one of the things that we had is full face masks, and
Yeah.
there's a couple different, types of full face masks and yada, yada, yada. But I also wondered if molded mouthpieces would make it better, worse. Is that an option?
Yeah, so I use a molded mouthpiece. I really like molded mouthpieces, but it wouldn't be an easy thing to do a molded mouthpiece for everybody who uses our regulator sets, right?
Yeah.
I do recommend for your own personal use, get a molded mouthpiece. But in terms of tactile, I found that the full face masks work best for people who have any facial concerns when it comes to having a regulator in their mouth. And so the full face mask really does work well. But yeah, I do like the molded mouthpiece a lot. In fact, my regulator set is just as of today in the shop being serviced because they've been really busy and packed up. And so I had to use one that's not molded to my mouth, and I have a unique mouth, and I'm used to my my molded mouthpiece, and it really does make a difference. I would say for people with any mouth issues or disabilities, get a molded mouthpiece, and you can always add it even if you don't have a regulator set, you can easily swap that out and bring it with you for anything, for any diving that you're doing. But for these events, it wouldn't really be feasible to do that.
Yeah, I figured for more of like our HSA divers and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
for sure. Yeah. Matter of fact, I think we have one now that would really benefit from it, who has cerebral palsy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. That's a good idea. Good question. All right. Let's give Ronnie a round of applause. He has officially successfully completed all of his instructor lectures, and he moves on to Thursday, this coming Thursday, Instructor Institute, next Thursday, exam. Victor is next and has a 30-minute lecture on Tuesday. And then the following week, he has his 2 15-minute lectures. Also, Victor will be completing his instructor exam. So both of these excellent leadership candidates will be instructors just in a couple of weeks. So this is really exciting. And Ronnie is breaking ground, breaking barriers, and opening doors for lots of people. And so I'm really excited about this. This is huge for him to be earning his instructor certification as someone with paraplegia. And he's earning it. Let me say, he's worked super hard at pool sessions and lectures and open water dives, and he's a phenomenally good teacher. So I think this is well earned, and Ronnie, he did a great job tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, great job, Ronnie.
you.
And thank you
Great
for being
job.
such an inspiration. I appreciate that.
And those who attended on, the live stream on Facebook, we can't see you, but thank you for being there. And those who attended on Zoom, much appreciated to have those questions and the support that you're showing for Ronny tonight. And we hope to see you next week for Victor's lecture. All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Great job, Ronny. Good job.
Thank you.
Bye, Gabrielle.
Bye, Joelle.
Bye.